Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. This morning we have another sutta study with Ayya Soma and myself, Bhante Suddhaso. And we'll be talking about a discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya. This one is called the Avijjiasutta. So Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 10, sutta number 61. So first we can start by paying homage to the Buddhas. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sangham Namasami.
Okay. And Bhante, would you like to translate from Pali, or should I read from Venerable Bhikkhu Pali's translation?
As you wish.
Maybe you can translate. It's always nice to have the instant translation.
So this discourse, it's again Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 10, sutta number 61, the Avijjiasutta. And the Buddha starts off by saying, Purima bhikkhave koti napanya yati avijjaya. So there is no first point, there's no starting point that one can point out for ignorance. So in other words, one can't find a beginning point for ignorance. He says, Ito pube avijja na hosi atapacha samabhaviti. So you can't find a place where you can say, before this, there was no ignorance, and then after this, it came into being. And this is pointing to one of the basic principles of Buddhist thought, which is that there's no starting point, there's no beginning. No matter how far back you look in time, you'll always find something before that. And here he's pointing to the fact that there's no, it's not that in the past we had perfect wisdom and we lost it somewhere along the way, but actually we've been deluded all along. We've been deluded since beginningless time. And the Buddha continues, Evan chetang bhikkhave vucchati atachapanya panyayati irapachaya avijjati. So he says, and this is why it's said that what one can point out is the causes for ignorance. And he continues, he says, Avijjampahang bhikkhave saharang vadami no anaharang. He says, and I say that ignorance has nourishment. It is not without nourishment. So in other words, there are things which nourish and feed our ignorance, just as there's ways of starving it, ways of reducing the causes of ignorance. And he continues, he says, Kochaharo avijjaya. So what nourishes ignorance? And he replies to his own question. Panchanivarana tisa vachaniyam. He says, and one should say the 5 hindrances. And the 5 hindrances, of course, are interest in sensuality, aversion, dullness, agitation, and skepticism. So these are the 5 hindrances. And he continues, Panchapahang bhikkhave nivarana sahare vadami no anahare. He says, and the 5 hindrances have nourishment. They're not without nourishment. So again, there's a cause for these things. There's something that feeds the growth and maintenance of the 5 hindrances. And he says, Kochaharo panchanang nivarananang. So what's the nourishment for the 5 hindrances? It says, Tini ducharatani disavachaniyang. The 3 kinds of misconduct. So the 3 kinds of misconduct are misconduct by body, speech, and mind. So physical misconduct, verbal misconduct, and mental misconduct. And misconduct is any kind of behavior that is harmful, anything that harms either oneself or others. He continues, Tini pahang bhikkhave ducharitani saharang vidami no anaharani. And the three kinds of misconduct also have a nourishment, a basis. And what's that nourishment? Tina says, Indriya asangvaro tisavachaniyam. So non-restraint of one's sensory faculties. So when we don't restrain our sense faculties, then we're prone to misconduct by body, speech, and mind, which then leads to an increase in the 5 hindrances, which then leads to an increase in ignorance and delusion. So restraint of one's sense faculties, and this is one of the critical practices that we do in Buddhism. It's recognizing that when we fixate on certain sensory experiences, then we have a growth in unwholesome mind states. So making an effort to pay attention to what sensory input makes our mind more messy, more defiled, and what sensory input, on the other hand, supports the purity and clarity of mind. So non-restraint of the sense faculties means that one allows oneself to fixate on things which increase one's defilements. And he continues that non-restraint to the sense faculties depends upon its own nourishment. And what is that nourishment? And he replies, asata sampajanyam. So non-mindfulness and non-comprehension. So a lack of sati and sampajanya. So sati is mindfulness, and sampajanya means clear awareness or attentiveness. So when we're not mindful and we're not paying clear attention to our experience, then we're more likely to do things which make our mind messy because we don't necessarily recognize how fixating on certain things will lead to a growth in defilement. So practicing sense restraint depends upon mindfulness and awareness. And he says then also a lack of mindfulness and a lack of awareness also is fed by something. And it's fed by, he says, ayoniso manasikara. So manasikara is attention. Literally it means mental activity. It's actually the most literal meaning of this word, what you're doing with your mind. That's what manasikara means. Yoniso literally means, it's from the word yoni, which literally means womb. Or more figuratively, the origin of things, the cause of things. So yoniso manasikara is paying attention to the causal nature of things. So understanding the underlying cause-effect relationship behind experiences. And ayoniso manasikara then means mental activity which is not based upon a wise awareness of causality. So similarly, when we're not aware of the causal nature of our choices, then we're more inclined to make unwise decisions, to direct the mind in unwise ways. In ways which increase our defilements. And he continues, he says, so ayoniso manasikara, so this unwise attention, also has a nourishment, a basis. And he says that basis is asadhya, so a lack of faith, a lack of confidence. And in particular, he's talking about a lack of faith in the Dhamma, a lack of confidence in the Buddha's instructions. So if we have confidence and faith in the Buddha's teachings, then we'll make an effort to direct our mind accordingly. And therefore that creates the conditions for us to starve the defilements and to ultimately overcome ignorance and delusion. But if we lack faith and confidence in the Buddha's teachings, then we're much more likely to just follow our impulses and instincts, which is a code word for feeding our defilements, just following our defilements. And so he says there's also a nourishment, a causal basis for the growth of a lack of faith, and that is, he says, asadhamma savanang, so not listening to the true Dhamma, not listening to the good Dhamma. So sad dhamma, the prefix sad can mean either true or good. So sad dhamma means the true dhamma or the good dhamma. So if we don't listen to the dhamma, and you're all listening to a dhamma talk right now, so bonus points, you're going in the right direction. So if we don't listen to the dhamma, then we don't understand the dhamma, and if we don't understand the dhamma, then we can't have faith in the dhamma. You can't have faith in something that you don't know. So the first step is always to learn the Dhamma. It's always to understand the Dhamma, to make an effort to comprehend the Dhamma. So this step can't be skipped. It is important to make an effort to learn the Dhamma. And of course, the main way we do that is through studying the suttas. And of course, he says that not listening to the Dhamma also is fed by something. And what is it fed by? And he says, asapurasang sevo. So, sapurasa sang seva. So, sang seva means to associate with or spend time with. Sapurisa means a good person. So, the same prefix sat, which we saw in Sad Dhamma, which has the meaning of good or true. So, sapurisa means a good person. So, asapurisa sangsevo means not associating with good people, not spending time with good people. So if we don't spend time with good people, if instead we spend time with people of bad conduct, foolish people, greedy people, hateful people, then what happens? Well, I mean, odds are pretty low that we're going to learn any Dhamma from such people. In fact, they're likely to inspire us to develop wrong view and to engage in wrong behavior. So then the Buddha then summarizes. He says, in this way, we can see how when we don't associate with good people, then that fulfills the conditions for not hearing the good Dhamma. When we don't hear the good Dhamma, that fulfills the conditions for not having faith in the Dhamma. When we don't have faith in the Dhamma, then that fulfills the conditions for not having wise attention. When we don't have wise attention, then we're not likely to have mindfulness and awareness. When we don't have mindfulness awareness, then we're not going to restrain our sense faculties. When we don't restrain our sense faculties, then we're going to engage in misconduct. And when we engage in misconduct, then we're going to have more of the five hindrances. And when we have the five hindrances, then our ignorance will grow, will increase. And so the Buddha summarizes, he says, Evame tissa vijaya aharo hoti evancha paripuri. So he says, in this way, there is nourishment for ignorance. There is the fulfillment of ignorance, development of ignorance. Do you want to make some comments at this point, or should we keep going?
As you wish, Bhante. It's
Please,
actually pretty long.
Yeah,
sutta,
it is relatively long.
Maybe we can do the next paragraph because it's basically related.
Well, next he gives a simile. So he says, just as rain falling high up in the mountains fills the, let's see. So just as rain falling high up, actually, do you want to read the simile? Something poetic like this, it's probably better to do it from a translation rather than trying to do it spontaneously.
Yeah. Just as when it is raining and the rain pours down in thick droplets on a mountaintop, the water flows down along the slope and fills the clefts, gullies, and creeks. These becoming full fill up the pools, these becoming full fill up the lakes, these becoming full fill up the streams, these becoming full fill up the rivers, and these becoming full fill up the great ocean. Thus there is nutriment for the great ocean, and in this way becomes full. So too, not associating with good people, becoming full fills up not hearing the good Dhamma. Not hearing the good Dhamma, becoming full fills up lack of faith. Lack of faith, becoming full, fills up careless attention. Careless attention, becoming full, fills up lack of mindfulness and clear comprehension. Lack of mindfulness and clear comprehension, becoming full, fills up non-restraint of the sense faculties. Non-restraint of the sense faculties, becoming full, fills up the three kinds of misconduct. The three kinds of misconduct, becoming full, fill up the five hindrances. The five hindrances, becoming full, fill up ignorance. Thus there is nutriment for ignorance, and in this way it becomes full.
And actually, we might as well do the rest of the sutta, because the second part is actually in exactly the same format. It's just in the positive sense rather than the negative sense. So the Buddha starts with the bad news, as he usually likes to do it that way around. So first the bad news, now the good news. So then next the Buddha says, Vijavamuting pahang bhikkhave saharang vidami no anaharang. He says, knowledge and liberation also has nourishment. It is not without nourishment. So Vijja, knowledge, is in particular, it's knowledge of how to purify the mind. So knowledge of the nature of the mind, knowledge of what purifies or sullies the mind. And liberation is liberation from defilement. So liberation from greed and hatred. So Vijjavamuting then is one of the ways that we talk about the final goal of Buddhist practice. So complete awakening, complete enlightenment is the attainment of knowledge, so knowledge of the nature of the mind, and liberation from greed, hatred, and delusion. And so he says, Kochaharo Vijjavamutya, what is the nourishment for knowledge and liberation? And he says, Sattabojjhanga Tisavachaniyam, the 7 factors of awakening. So yesterday I gave a talk on the 7 bojjhangas. So mindfulness, investigation of Dhamma, energy, euphoria, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity, 7 factors of awakening. So this is the nourishment for knowledge and liberation. And he says also the 7 factors of awakening have nourishment, which is the Chattara Satipatthana, so the 4 domains of mindfulness. So mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feeling, mindfulness of the mind, and mindfulness of mental phenomena. So the 4 domains where we direct mindfulness. And I should also point out, by the way, that in the Satipatthana Suttas, the Buddha also clearly specifies that we should be paying attention to the arising and ceasing of phenomena within those domains. So just being mindful is not sufficient. One also needs to be mindful of impermanence within these 4 domains. And he says the 4 satipatthanas, so the 4 domains of mindfulness, also have nourishment, which is the 3 kinds of good conduct. So before he spoke about the 3 kinds of misconduct, so misconduct by body, speech, and mind. This is good conduct with body, speech, and mind. So that means acting, speaking, and thinking in ways which brings benefit to sentient beings, both to ourselves and to the others around us. And he says 3 kinds of good conduct also have nourishment, so that it's nourished by sense restraint. So again, being careful not to direct our mind in ways that fuel our defilements. Sense restraint has a nourishment, which is mindfulness and attentiveness, mindfulness and awareness, sati sampajanya. And that has a basis, which is yoniso manasikara. So again, this wise attention, paying attention to the cause and effect relationship in our experiences. And wise attention also has a basis, which is faith. And faith has a basis, which is hearing the good Dhamma. And hearing the good Dhamma has a basis, which is associating with good people. So he says here in this way, one can see that associating with good people fulfills the conditions for hearing the good Dhamma. Hearing the good Dhamma fulfills the conditions for having for having faith. Having faith fulfills the conditions for wise attention, which fulfills the conditions for mindfulness and awareness, which fulfills the conditions for sense restraint, fulfills the conditions for the 3 kinds of good conduct, fulfills the conditions for the 4 bases of mindfulness, which fulfills the conditions for the 7 factors of awakening, which fulfills the conditions for knowledge and liberation. And then again, he gives the same simile of water falling high in the mountains and slowly filling up the cracks and clefts and pools and eventually filling up the ocean. And in the same way, these qualities each fulfill and nourish each other in sequence. So that's the end of the sutta. So we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
And since I've been doing most of the talking so far, we can invite Ayya Soma to make some comments and reflections on this discourse.
Thank you, Bhante, for translating that sutta really beautifully, instantly. Lots of Dhammasuka. Yeah, well, I selected this sutta, so clearly I like it a lot. And just as with pretty much all the teachings of the Buddha, they're just so beautiful because they essentially explain to us everything has a cause and condition. Nothing is random. And so even when we go, our mind perhaps tends to ask kind of the wrong questions, like, oh, where is this ignorance coming from? Where is this? We're always trying to kind of look of why is it there? Who put it there? Right? We tend to, why am I living in this predicament? And it's instead of actually addressing those types of questions that are not terribly useful, instead it's more pointing out to, well, what are the conditions that essentially can be removed in order to remove this effect that we don't like, and who cares why it's there, who put it there, and where it's coming from, and so forth. But rather, it's just going straight to kind of matter-of-factly way of empowering us to do something right here, right now, about this situation that we are experiencing, and mapping out the sort of process of causality and interdependence of all of these factors. Essentially, this is another way we tend to think of dependent origination in terms of the 12 links of dependent origination that can sometimes sound very abstruse and sound very kind of philosophical, and people can get very sort of complicated about it, and and I feel like sometimes missing the point of the teachings of the Buddha that are all about dependent origination, but in the sense that everything is dependently arisen, everything is the product of different causes and conditions, and so in this sutta we see very much another way of basically talking about dependent origination, another way of highlighting things that are a little bit more relatable. Some things kind of in layman terms, so to speak, right? So we're like, yeah, ignorance, where is it coming from? Yeah, sure, like, from the 5 hindrances. Yeah, I have that experience of the 5 hindrances. And so how does that come into being? What am I doing in order to fool that? Oh, through not particularly useful conducts through body, speech, and mind. And why am I doing that? Oh, because I haven't really being capable of developing good sense restraint, and so forth. So like we can actually really start analyzing our experience, analyzing our actions, and start going all the way, unfolding it all the way up to, oh, not associating with good people. That's what I got wrong most of my life. Right? So it's very interesting, because then when we start seeing our life and our actions through these lenses, we also start understanding a little bit better the forms that we find in traditional Buddhism as well. Personally, when I encountered the Dhamma, I was identifying as agnostic, and I had been identifying as agnostic since the age of 10, when I had decided that I was not believing in Catholicism anymore, and that I was going to refuse to do any sort of religious kind of form unless I really believed in something. So when I encountered Buddhism, I was like, oh, this sounds really interesting. And I would go to the temple and I was like, oh, this is pretty great. But, I didn't identify as Buddhist. So I was refusing to bow. I was refusing to chant. I was refusing to do pretty much anything that was not meditation and listening to Dhamma talks. And it's my mind was perceiving as all of these things as essentially not terribly necessary. Like the bowing, for example, was something that didn't look very necessary to me. Or also the lighting incense. I was like, it's really not necessary, and pretty much everything that was not studying sort of the texts, or once again meditation practice, something kind of tangible, it didn't seem necessary. And then I remember at a certain point while I was on retreat, doing this intensive meditation retreat, at a certain point I was like, how about I just bow? And I just bowed. And I remembered, it was just the kind of simple thing that I did. And it just somewhat created those conditions for the mind to take a little bit more seriously these teachings, a little bit more seriously, a little bit more, like opening up. Being a little bit more committed. And there was something that shifted in the mind. And the more I was kind of taking on these forms that were given to us by the tradition, the more there was a bit of a shift in the mind. And the more that would create conditions actually to associate with good people, which is basically what is connected with this sutta. And we see that, all the really impressive actually practitioners, impressive monastics, they're always really surrounded by lots of awesome lay people, for example, and actually also awesome monastics as well, really impressive monastics, really beautiful also junior monastics, and beautiful in the sense not that they look pretty physically, but have all these beautiful qualities of mind, right? Of attentiveness, of generosity, of kindness. And so we see in other suttas, actually, the Buddha essentially indicates gives these essentially directions of cultivating these qualities of reverence and deference in the mind, not because we're supposed to do it, not because such and such person tells you to do it, not because it's kind of like a requirement, but rather because it's a condition that then creates an ability, an ease to then be more in tune, more close association with good people. And then, of course, by being in association with good people, then one can have good access to the Dhamma and so forth, as we've seen here in the sutta. And it's kind of like this domino effect. So it's not that, you have to really necessarily like focus on on cultivating all of these sort of aspects, but rather you kind of like, you give it, just like a domino effect, right? You like kick one and you get all at the same time. And so it's very interesting when we start looking at the path, I feel like in this in this other way, in this way where every single action that we do has many implications, many causes, many effects. And then we are truly really understanding the origin of things, as we were talking about also the other day. So anyway, these are some disjointed thoughts that are coming to mind. Bhante, if you have some reflections you'd like to share.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of minor comments about this sutta, and then maybe we can move to questions after that. The main thing I wanted to point out, by the way, is the placement of the 4 Satipatthanas in the sequence. So often when people come to Buddhism, if they're not raised in a Buddhist culture, then often the way they get into Buddhist practice is through meditation. And one of the most commonly used frameworks for meditation in the Buddhist world is the Satipatthanas. So the Satipatthana suttas, the Satipatthana meditation practices. And very commonly what happens is someone will start with practicing some kind of Satipatthana meditation. And it's really difficult, and it's really challenging, and they struggle for years and years and years, making slow, painful, difficult progress, if much progress at all. And then at some point, they'll go to a monastery and ask, why is that? This is ideal case scenario. They'll go to a monastery and ask, why is this not going so well? Why is this so difficult? How could this be? How can we do this more easily? And actually the answer is right here in the sutta. So rather than ask, how can I do Satipatthana meditation more effectively? As Ayya Soma was saying, instead we should be asking, how can I create supporting conditions for Satipatthana practice? So what are the conditions I can create which will make it easier to practice Satipatthana meditation? So often the difficulties that we're having with our meditation practice is not to do with the meditation method itself. Sometimes it is. Sometimes we're just using a method that isn't really suited for our particular mind. But often the difficulty is not with the meditation itself, but with a lack of supportive conditions in our life. It's about what we're doing the rest of the time when we're not meditating. So here the Buddha is saying that the basis for practicing the 4 Satipatthanas, so the basis for Satipatthana meditation, mindfulness meditation, is good conduct. So good conduct with body, speech, and mind. So following the 5 precepts, not killing, not stealing, not engaging in sexual misconduct, not telling lies, not using intoxicants. Also following the extended description of right speech that we find in the Eightfold Path, or in the 10 bases of wholesome activity. So refraining from malicious gossip, divisive gossip. This actually is really important. I can't even list how many people I've met who in theory were good, dedicated Buddhist practitioners, but they love to gossip. And they love to spread nasty rumors about other people. And oh my, did you hear what Venerable so-and-so did? Oh,
what did they do?
I mean, it was so rude. I can't believe it. You have to hear this. And so just this delight in spreading malicious gossip. And it's like, well, no wonder your meditation is going poorly. You're not fulfilling the 3 forms of right conduct. Or engaging in a lot of useless chatter, sampapalapa in Pali. So useless chatter. So this is one reason why we practice noble silence during meditation retreats. If you want to have good meditation, well, good meditation depends upon having a relatively quiet mind. And having a relatively quiet mind depends upon having a relatively quiet mouth. Mm-hmm. So the more we engage in a bunch of chatter, like, oh, did you see the latest episode of blah, blah, blah? Or did you hear about the latest scientific discovery? Or, oh, well, President so-and-so said such and such to so-and-so. Well, who the hell cares? Like, seriously. Why are we filling our mind with all this useless noise? And then you go and sit down to meditate and you're like, why is my mind so full of useless noise? Well, what do you think you've been doing to your mind all day long? All that useless chatter that we do with our mouth just contributes to a lot of useless chatter in the mind. It's not particularly surprising. So really paying attention to these, again, these 10 bases of wholesome conduct. So the 3 of body, 4 of speech, and 3 of mind. This is the basis for a good meditation practice. So not killing, not stealing, not engaging in sexual misconduct. So that means being honest and respectful in one's sexual relationships. So 4 kinds of right speech. So not lying, not speaking harshly, not engaging in divisive gossip, and not engaging in useless chatter. The 4 kinds of right speech. And the 3 kinds of right mental conduct, which means mental conduct based on renunciation. So nekkhamma vitakka, thoughts of renunciation, of letting go, of non-attachment. Avijjiasutta sankappa, so non-cruelty, non-harming. So avijjiasutta sankappa. Avyapada sankappa, so non-aversion, non-ill will. So this means cultivating the thoughts of loving kindness, of compassion, and of renunciation. So these are the bases for good meditation. And similarly, the 3 kinds of right conduct are based on sense restraint. Again, what do we normally tend to do? When something appealing is within range of our senses, we fixate on what's appealing. Or if something annoying or disgusting is present, then we also fixate on that. We're like, God, I really hate that person. I hate how they talk. I hate how they move. I hate everything about them. Well, then just don't look at them. This actually is the Buddha's advice. Just don't look at them. Problem solved. That was easy. Or similarly, if you're really caught up in desire for something, again, well, just don't look at it. If you don't look at it, then you don't think about it. And then there's no problem. But when we fixate on something, then it becomes more deeply stuck in the mind. And then that makes it more likely that we're going to do something inappropriate or say something inappropriate. And sense restraint depends upon mindfulness and awareness, so constantly paying attention to what we're doing with our body, speech, and mind. You can't restrain yourself if you don't know what you're doing. And that depends upon being aware of causality. So again, yona soma sikara means paying attention to causality, being aware of the causal basis of our experiences. This means karma, reflecting on karma, paying attention to karma. So yonaso manasikara fundamentally means paying attention to the world in terms of karma. So noticing the causal nexus, the cause and effect relationship to our experiences, which is something which we have faith in because we've been listening to the good Dhamma. We've been learning the Dhamma. We've been making an effort to understand the Dhamma. And all of that comes because you chose to spend your weekend at the monastery instead of at the bar with your friends. So, as in your former friends, the ones who you're not going to hang out with anymore because they spend their time at the bar instead of at the monastery. So you can see, once again, how there's a basis. If you want to have good meditation, it starts with spending your weekend at the monastery instead of at the bar. And then that naturally leads to this whole progression of cultivating right view, of cultivating morality. And then that right view and morality is what forms the basis for actually being able to get somewhere in your meditation practice. Those are just a couple comments I wanted to add about this.
Thank you, Bhante. I would say that the preliminary condition in order to not spend the weekend at the bar is actually what's really helpful is to take the 5 precepts and then be sober hanging out at the bar with your friends during the weekend. And that creates a lot of dispassion. That's exactly how I stopped. Like, wow, this is only fun for the first 5 minutes until everybody gets drunk except for myself. Yeah. And do I actually want to spend the rest of my life? Basically wasted making nonsensical talk. It really creates this really immediate dispassion. You don't even have to work on it. You're like, wow, this is a really dumb way of spending my time. Do I really want to do this? Not really. So then there's something else that comes that builds up in the mind. That one goes like, there must be more than just wasting time waiting to die, basically, while doing this sort of silly type of actions. All right, we have, I think,
a few questions. Well, first off, hello to all the people joining in online. So hello to Gita Jnana, Gita Brown, JS, John, Matthias, Sud, Yankee, Douglas, Kobe, Andy, Lo, Julie, Usha, Niranjan, Sopav, Clark, Hermano, Christina, Marielle, Charles Lee, Suman, and Karuna. So hello to all of you. Good to see so many people checking in online. And there's a couple questions online here. Let's see. Sud asks, how do we protect our minds in lay life since most people we interact with are not sappurisas? Well, then spend more time interacting with sappurisas and less time interacting with oh, well, it's asapurisa, non-good people. Yeah, you get to choose who you spend time with. You're not obligated to spend time with bad people. And it's a little bit more awkward if they're your relatives, admittedly. But generally speaking, you can choose to spend more time with good people and less time with bad people. And that starts the domino going.
Yeah, I would say that that's definitely true that one makes selections. So it's also important not to start building up a conceit of superiority towards people who don't have access to the Dhamma or are not practitioners. And actually, to be quite frank, I feel like there's a lot of goodness in so many people. Actually, as a monastic, I have to say that we're constantly exposed to the beauty of humanity. And when we do practices like the Tudong practice, for example, of going in places where, nobody is Buddhist and nobody is expecting us, nobody is practicing anything sometimes, or if they're practicing different sort of, religious systems. It's just remarkable to see the beauty of actually the human mind. So we can appreciate that. We can actually acknowledge that. We can actually also make it present to people who are not perhaps fully, even if they're maybe they can't break the 5 precepts because they haven't taken the 5 precepts. Let's say they're not following 5 precepts, but they're following 1 out of the 5 precepts. We can still praise that. And I think that actually is for their benefit and also for the benefit of ourselves. And that also helps to a certain degree protecting our minds. At least that's my experience whenever I go to places where I'm surrounded by non-practitioners, is really like acknowledging out loud, not only in my mind, but really praising good actions, praising the good virtue. And just it uplifts oneself, one's perception of the situation, also uplifts the other person usually, and then they're also more interested in perhaps knowing a little bit more about what our practice is. Lots of my friends from my previous life within this life, for example, whenever we go to Italy, Bhante Suddhaso has met many of my previous friends, which are basically my extended chosen family. None of them are Buddhist practitioners, but every time they're like, oh, okay, let's, they're interested in making merit. They're also interested in sometimes practicing meditation. So that just comes from really acknowledging what we have in common and mutually inspiring ourselves. So this is something that I would like to say, because sometimes we can really get kind of like, look at all these like minions out there, only us like Buddhist practitioners, we've got it. I mean, really, we've got the theory, but the practice is something else.
Joe, you have a question?
Thank you, Bhante. I'm trying to contemplate the 5 hindrances and what a mind absent of those might be like. So I was thinking of there's sensual desire, and mind free from that is pure. Ill will, free from that is warm. Sloth and torpor, a mind free from that is radiant. Restlessness, a mind free from that is serene. And doubt, a mind free from that is clear. And I was trying to contemplate what is something that is pure, warm, radiant, serene, and clear. And what came to mind was light. And I was wondering if you think that a light kasina or a white light kasina would be something beneficial to delight the mind or purify the mind in this way?
I wouldn't recommend it. Yeah. Don't get too creative or imaginative. So if we get, especially if someone is a delusion type, then getting too creative and imaginative tends to just lead to daydreaming and wasting huge amounts of time. So it doesn't usually lead to good meditation. It usually just leads to wasting huge amounts of time. That's an ideal scenario. It leads to wasting time. More likely is it actually leads to an increase in delusion. So not recommended. So the kasina practices are not recommended for delusion types, and they're actually not recommended for most people, period, regardless of what personality type they are. So no, I don't particularly recommend doing the light kasina. As for the opposite of the 5 hindrances, actually in the suttas, the Buddha is quite clear that the opposite of the 5 hindrances is the 7 bojjhangas, 7 factors of awakening. He's always setting these two sets as opposites to each other. So the 5 hindrances, the opposite is the 7 factors of awakening. If you want to do it piece by piece, well, the opposite of sensual desire is contentment. The opposite of aversion is metta. The opposite of dullness is alertness. The opposite of agitation is serenity. The opposite of skepticism is confidence. But yeah, again, usually the Buddha describes the opposites as being the 7 bojjhanga.
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I've been studying the disciples of the Buddha, and Mahamoggallana, Venerable Mahamoggallana, was apparently a delusion type, and he would keep falling asleep. And the Buddha recommended that he contemplate perceptions of light. So that's where I got the idea.
Yeah, but you're not Moggallana. So the Buddha gave an instruction to Mahamoggallana, but you're not Mahamoggallana.
No, but if I'm falling asleep, shouldn't I be using the same using the same methods that he uses, like to keep yourself from being hazy? Wouldn't light be something that would be clearing and keep them on
So
alert?
as I said before, the light kasina is not recommended for delusion types. So the specific advice the Buddha gave to Mahamoggallana was advice to Mahamoggallana. So I have never encountered a single Buddhist teacher ever who has encouraged kasina meditation for delusion types. In fact, I've only encountered 1 or 2 in my entire monastic life who encouraged kasina meditation at all.
Wow.
And even then, not for delusion types. So the light kasina as being a way of overcoming drowsiness, I know very, very few people who have had success with that. So usually if drowsiness is a problem, you stand up, or you meditate with your eyes open, or you go and do walking meditation, or you just drink a cup of tea before the meditation, or choose a more active and engaging meditation practice. But going to kasina meditation is very risky and rarely productive. So not recommended.
So is kasina meditation, is the kasina on light and perception of light different, or are those the same thing? Is a kasina a perception?
So perception of light, properly speaking, would be paying attention to light. But the practice of the perception of light is a bit more complex than that. And I don't want to get into that right now because it's very off topic of the sutta. So we can talk another time about the practice of the perception of light. Yeah, go ahead.
I really appreciated this sutta a lot. Feels like it brought in, connected so many dots, and I'll percolate with that. But I had one specific question, which I think was partially addressed, but I just want to hear a little more about the relationship and distinction between yoniso manasikara and mindfulness.
Okay. Well, in the sutta, the Buddha is saying that yoniso manasikara is the basis for sati sampajanya. So yoniso manasikara, as I mentioned earlier, yoniso manasikara literally means paying attention to causality. So being aware of the causal basis of things, being aware of how when we do this, then that happens. When we don't do this, then that doesn't happen. So that's basically yoniso manasikara. It means paying attention to the cause and effect relationship. Then once we have that already in mind, then we start looking, well, what are the causes and what are the effects? So that's why I would say it's the basis for mindfulness. You need to know what to be mindful of. So kind of like generalized mindfulness in theory, it sounds like a good idea, but usually it just winds up being this kind of vague, blurry stumbling in our own delusions. So it's important to start with some idea of what we're looking for. Otherwise, the mind, sometimes the mind will settle into sharpness, but often it doesn't. So once one's practice is relatively advanced, then one can do just directly do mindfulness without focusing the mind in any particular way. But in the beginning, we need to have some idea of what we're looking for. So yeah, I think it's also emphasizing the basis of right view. So in many suttas, the Buddha directly links yoniso manasikara with right view. That these two things are very closely interrelated. So it's paying attention to what causes what. So noticing, again, what's going on in the mind. What choices are we making? What effect is it having? And then you start paying much sharper attention. Does that make any sense?
Thank you. I just wanted to hear the particular connection because it felt like mindfulness was smaller, but I wanted to understand the exact thing.
Yeah, there's actually also lots of the poems of the Deities, not but actually quite a few, where some are pretty dramatic, where they just talk about how they can't essentially establish mindfulness and they're plagued 5 years, 10 years, not even for one split second was I able to settle the mind or concentrate the mind essentially. And a lot of the times what is actually emphasized is not being capable of seeing the origin of things. So not being capable of establishing yoniso manasikara. So there is a clear, I remember when I was translating it with careful attention, it was just a little bit odd, which is then what started our investigation. I was like, well, there has to be a little bit of a better sense, a deeper meaning, and actually not understanding causality has makes so much more sense in the context also of those poems of really I can't remember the poem. There's this particular thing, I can't remember her name, that essentially draws the connection of all the of being plagued by sensual desire, so wanting this sensory stimuli, you can say. So having kamaraga, actually a lot of in the current translations that's translated as just lust or sexual desire, but it actually doesn't really make sense. I think it was actually translated as lust. This is my speculation because the majority of translators were men. So there's like this fixation. So it was like the poem, it was all about sex. And I was like, it just doesn't sound quite right. And really what it's pointing out is that like, I just want something. I want to experience something. I want, sensuality essentially, to experience something with the 5 or 6 senses. And that the strong connection was in fact with not seeing causality, not seeing when this arises, when this ceases.
Dan?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the emphasis the Buddha has placed on wise spiritual friendship. Is very clear throughout the suttas. And yet there is a Dhammapada verse that says basically a fool who lives with wise people for his whole life, just like a spoon will never know the taste of the soup, is still a fool. And I'm wondering, in relation to this, I mean, it's pretty clear that wise friendship is a prerequisite. So what is the fool doing wrong that the wise friendship is not becoming, that is not leading to the next step down the waterfall?
Well, I think the point that the Buddha is making in that Dhammapada verse, and I would need to have a look at it again, Like I vaguely remember the one you're talking about, but I don't remember the details. But I think the point the Buddha is making is that one still needs to make an effort to transform one's mind. It doesn't necessarily happen automatically. Yeah, a fool can hang out with wise people, but they might have zero interest in becoming wise. So actually, I think of some of the people the Buddha met, they weren't the least bit interested in learning what the Buddha had to say. And so did they get any benefit from encountering the Buddha? It's not clear that they really got any benefit at all. So you can meet the most impressive spiritual teacher, but if you're not interested in learning, then you won't learn. You'll just be like, okay, met a weirdo today, who cares, moving on. You can actually have a friend who could be the wisest person you've ever met in your entire life, but you only want to talk about football, so you never learn anything from them. And you're like, well, that weirdo doesn't drink. Well, that's just because he's weird. I like to drink, so that's my token sober friend, because it's nice to have a token sober friend. But there's no interest in actually following their example, because seriously, who would want to do that? So yeah, I mean, if the fool has no interest in becoming wiser, then they won't. We still make deliberate choices. But the point is, if you don't have good examples in your life, then it's much harder to follow a good example if you don't have any. So you start by establishing good examples, and then it's much easier to follow those good examples. But you still need to have the intention to follow their example. It doesn't necessarily happen all by itself.
So interest and intention is also in this waterfall sequence that the Buddha is describing.
It's not specifically mentioned in this particular discourse, but it's mentioned in countless other discourses. So this points to another important principle of the suttas, which is that every sutta has to be taken in the context of all the other suttas. Otherwise, one can easily arrive at misunderstandings. Sure. Actually, a great example of this is the Sivaka Sutta, where the Buddha is talking about karma. And if you take that sutta as a standalone by itself, then you can easily come to some really bad wrong views. But if you take it in the context of all the other suttas where the Buddha talks about karma, then you can see how that one fits in. It's expressing a specific detail, but that detail is meant to be taken within a larger picture. Kind of like that picture behind you, the one of the silhouette of the Buddha. You could look at it and say, oh, that picture is yellow. And that's technically true, but it's only representing a tiny piece of the picture. So if you then go around telling everyone that the picture is yellow, the picture is yellow, the picture is yellow, I would actually say no. It's a silhouette of a Buddha under a tree looking at a sunset, or possibly a forest fire. It's hard to say. And so saying it's yellow is technically true, but communicates only a little bit of the actual information. So in the same way, like if we take any one statement of the Buddha out of context, then we can sometimes arrive at a misunderstanding, which actually flows neatly into the next question from the live stream. So Karuna says, quote, "Who the hell cares?" unquote. Bhante Suddhaso. So this again shows the danger of taking quotes out of context.
Oh, that's great. I think we should compile aphorisms by Bhante Suddhaso collection. Pretty great.
Yeah, actually, I was just recently reading through a book of fake Buddha quotes, and actually one of the quotes in the list was actually a real quote from the suttas, but it was taken out of context. And when taken out of context, it seems to be saying exactly the opposite of what it means in context. So this is one of the dangers of quotes, is without the context, you can sometimes get completely the wrong meaning from something. And Kumu says, what do you think of lay people following the Ajiva Ashtamika? I assume you mean the 8 lifetime sila, the 8 lifetime precepts. 3 via body, 4 via speech, plus right livelihood. Yeah, and it's good. It's just the Noble Eightfold Path. It's just a condensation of things from the Noble Eightfold Path. That's all. So yeah, of course it's good. And we have a few more questions online. So let's go through these. JS says, I read books by Ajahn Chah and Ajahn Sumedho every day to learn the Dhamma. Does that fulfill the requirement to learn the Dhamma? No. But it's a good start. So that should be seen as supplementary material, not as core material. So that's the salad dressing, not the salad. Would you encourage me to read more of the suttas? Yes, that is the core material. So everything else should be seen as commentaries and opinions about the suttas. So if you don't read the suttas and you just read the commentaries and opinions, then you will never really know the Dhamma. You'll just have kind of a hint at the Dhamma, but you won't really know the Dhamma. So yes, absolutely, you do need to read the suttas. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Ajahn Chah, and I gained great benefit from reading Ajahn Chah books. But without reading the suttas, if you only read Ajahn Chah books, then yeah, you're not going to get a full picture of the Dhamma. It's always going to be a little bit incomplete and distorted. Kind of like a translation. If you, let's say you start with a statement in English, and then you translate it to French, and then you translate it to Latin, and then you translate it to German, and then you translate it to Chinese, and then you translate it to Japanese, and then you translate it to Sri Lankan, and then you translate it to Hindi, then what do you wind up with? Might sound kind of nice, but it's probably significantly different from the original statement. So in the same way, if you take, well, the Buddha said this, and then Ajahn so-and-so said this, and then Ajahn so-and-so said this, and then Bhante so-and-so said this, and Ayya so-and-so said this, and Ayya so-and-so said this. Well, that's all well and good, and it might sound pretty good, and it might even, if you're lucky, it might even be relatively close to the Dhamma, but it's still going through some kind of alteration over time. So yes, you have to read the suttas. There's no getting around it. Okay. And Yoel says, you had a Mahayanist on, and at the risk of sounding divisive, should we entertain other traditions? And how would that avoid contradictions? Ayya Soma?
Well, I mean, we're technically a non-sectarian monastery, so, well, I think clearly we don't see a contradiction in that. We're also focused on the early Buddhist teachings, so it's also very interesting because people tend to identify early Buddhism with the Theravada tradition. Perhaps, but actually that's not really the case. So the early teachings of the Buddha are actually shared by, if not all, the Buddhist traditions, most traditions. And then there's also not only the texts, even though we're big fans of the suttas here, there's something more to it. When we're talking about an oral tradition, for example, there's a lot of things that, are just cannot be found in just this, even though this is great. And I feel I actually being exposed to so many different traditions personally. Well, first and foremost, I started noticing this really interesting pattern in my mind. I remember at the very beginning, I was like, oh, wow, the forest tradition of Theravada, these monastics, this is the real deal. This is, the only type of Buddhism that actually is worth following. These guys are great. Look at how they follow the Vinaya. Yeah, not like all those other sects that the generation of the teachings, etc. And then we would have a Mahayana monastic, and I'm like, oh, wow, this is actually the real deal. Look at the compassion that these monastics have developed. They're so inspiring. Not like those Hinayanas of the Theravada, so self-absorbed. Actually, this is the real deal. I'm just going to practice the Mahayana teachings from now on. It's the supreme vehicle. And then the Tibetans would come, and I'm like, oh, wow, this is like a step further. Actually, the Tibetans really, really, really got it right. Perfectly incredible. I mean, the Mahayanas were okay, but this is like just incredible. Like, this is where we're at. Elucidates the whole path. And then, the Theravada monastic would come back and like, maybe now it was the Sri Lankan flavor. I'm like, oh no, actually look at the Sri Lankan monks. And like, they really know the suttas, not like every other one. And so like, at a certain point, I started noticing this pattern in my mind, and I just had to laugh, about it, because every single monastic, we were so privileged actually to, before the pandemic, we would have constantly this flow of senior monastics coming in almost every week. And so it's just obviously this pure, beautiful Dhamma. And in the end, what I really noticed, that what was my mind was responding to was not necessarily the Theravada, the Mahayana, or the Vajrayana, but it was actually responding to the Dhamma, the flavor of the Dhamma. And it comes through different shapes and forms. And sometimes what I find really helpful, actually, of listening to teachings in from different perspectives, is precisely the different perspectives. And so we can get very stuck in, only this is true, everything else is wrong. Well, page 1417, the Anguttara Nikaya, it says this. And, if someone says something else, you can get very defensive and very like kind of stuck on that, and start identifying the Dhamma as this sort of intellectual kind of wording. So usually, every tradition has a history. So there's also a different way through which, for example, in the Zen tradition, the teachings are explained. And they are explained in a way that it's meant to actually shake, be sometimes also intentionally controversial, to create those conditions for the mind to stop being so fossilized and kind of open up. So I find it very refreshing, like something like when you think you've seen the Buddha kill the Buddha, like, whoa, shocking, like, whoa, like seriously? I remember reading that and going like, whoa, shocking and super cool, in the sense of like, obviously it doesn't literally encourage you to kill a Buddha. It's also impossible, nor to kill an arahat. That's really bad karma. But actually to kill the belief of what we think enlightenment is. So within ourselves, like when we think we have attained enlightenment, right now, especially in this sort of degenerate era, there are so many people who they're the least impressive people in the world that claim levels of awakening. I was like, wow, seriously. And that's what it means when you think you've seen the Buddha, kill the Buddha. When you think that is enlightenment, kill that sort of idea. Question yourself. And so when you think you understand that the Dhamma, that because you read it on page 1417 of the Anguttara Nikaya, translated by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, kill that. Like, start constantly questioning it. And so, yes, being exposed to all these different traditions, is very useful. I find it to at least for what my interest is, to practice the teachings of the Buddha.
Okay, great. And Malanak says, they always say to watch your thoughts. Who is they? But from my experience, it seems that it's not possible to watch your own thoughts, because when you try to watch your thoughts, you don't have no thoughts. I think you're overthinking this. It just practice mindfulness of body and mindfulness of mind. And when thoughts are present, be aware that thoughts are present. When thoughts are not present, be aware that thoughts are not present.
Yeah, and I feel like also, a lot of the practice is, looking at the thoughts, then getting caught into the thoughts, and then getting back into essentially the practice of what we had started with in meditation. I can't speak English this morning. I'm sorry. It's very difficult.
This person says, which book of suttas should one start to read first from Tipitaka?
In the Buddha's words, actually. That is the anthology that Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi created. which is just an incredible piece of work, like in the sense of it gives you an overview of the path. That book officially converted me to Buddhism. I was just blown away. Spoiler, you will be the uninstructed worldling of the book. It's a little bit depressing and also incredibly inspiring, because once you realize you're the uninstructed worldling, you want to become a noble disciple. You're like, okay, let me do something about this really sad state of affairs.
And there's more questions, but I'm starting to feel like this is getting into monk chat territory.
Oh.
Unless we want to just give quick answers to these and conclude there.
I think we can, give briefly and then.
Okay, so Prina says, are there any traditions that primarily focus on practicing Vipassana and secondarily the teachings and texts? Yes, such things do exist. Not recommended. The Buddha was very clear that right view is the forerunner of all wholesome states. Right view is the foundation of the Buddhist path. So trying to skip right view and go directly into Vipassana meditation usually does not work. This is one of the things that leads to people practicing for decades without making significant progress, because they don't have the foundation of right view. So yes, there are such things in the world, but I don't see a reasonable basis for such ways of practicing. You have to start with right view. And the main way you start with right view is through studying the texts. They say, is it important to balance both theory and practice? Yeah, without theory, there is no practice. You might think you're practicing, but without theory, you're not practicing correctly. And Arnold says, is it okay to practice just in the hopes of being as healthy as possible, as mindful as possible, without a goal in mind like stream entry or hardship? Are all these goals necessary to improve?
Well, I would say that actually, since I started practicing Buddhism, I've never been this unhealthy physically. So I wouldn't recommend it for that. This being said, my mental health has improved dramatically, but my physical health, quite the opposite. I mean, also I'm chronically vitamin D deficient because I'm enclosed in a monastery in the northern United States. So yeah, I feel like we tend to have these sort of expectations from spiritual practice that are not, I mean, they could happen, but they're not really necessarily the purpose why we're practicing. Mindful and more mindful as possible. Yeah, that's actually definitely a nice side effect of Buddhist practice, but the healthy part, not really. I mean, really, the teachings of the Buddha, all the Buddha taught is, this is suffering, this is the cause of suffering, this is the end of suffering, this is the way out of suffering. So if you're interested in the end of suffering, then that's essentially why you want to practice the teachings of the Buddha. That does end up with, at least arhatship. If you don't want to call it that way, if you don't feel comfortable with those terms, but you're interested in the cessation of suffering, yes. If you want to be 10% happier, just literally go to Italy or go to Mexico. Mexico's great. I was 20% happier when I went there. I was like, this is great. I'm having a really good time. Good food, good people. Like, it's, you don't really need to do all of these different sort of practices. If you want to be 100% happier, then yeah, and do the teachings of the Buddha.
Okay. And I think we should go ahead and end it this time. Thank you all for joining in, and you can join this evening for our weekly monk chat where you can ask any other questions you might have. So we'll go ahead and end the session at this time with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see.